So for the full day, I need to check.
Yes, right. So Michael is going to bring in some more water, hot water cells. So we didn't anticipate that hot water. And let's try to get some. So to me, it sounds like I'm trying to teach you Chinese UMR annotation, but I realize that most people here are not native speakers of Chinese necessarily. So I think the main point I want to try to talk about is if you wanted to work on, so we have been talk about the UMR annotation mostly for English, right? So what does it take to annotate a different language? What kind of issues they might still have, right? So we claim that UMR annotation, the scheme should apply to all languages, right? But are there still going to be issues when you approach a specific language? So that's one of the things. I try to give a few examples of what happens in Chinese annotation, so that you can sort of get a sense of the sort of issues that you still run into, which means you might still need to have some sort of guidelines for annotating your own languages. That's the main thing. So I have a long list of things that are, even if you are familiar with the UMR guidelines, and there might still issues that come up for individual languages. For example, the first one would be, what is the concept for each language, right? Like Chinese is written without spaces between words. So the first thing you have to figure out is what are the words. Okay. And after you know the words, then you figure out, okay, what is the concept, right? So that's the first thing that you do not necessarily have if you're working on, let's say, for English, right? The second thing is that Chinese is a language that does not have a lot of morphological markings, which can sound like a good thing because if you're working on polysynthetic languages, the entire sentence is a one word. So you kind of have to do a lot of decomposition into different concepts. Chinese has the opposite problem. When you don't have morphology, let's say for a language you do not have tense, right? So suddenly annotating the temporal relations between for a event is getting a little problematic. It's a little harder to decide, right? So you poses a different kinds of problem. The same thing for aspects. Although we do have a few aspect markers, but it's kind of sparse. You don't have it on every word. So you can really depends on what the context is. So the other thing is that the pronouns can be dropped in Chinese, right? So we're talking about person and number, but when the pronoun is dropped, so what is that, right? So you kind of have to infer from the context. Depends on who it refers to, and then you figure out what is the value for those. And the other thing is that the discourse relations also tend to be implicit. So this is probably not unrelated phenomena, right? So it's morphologically poor. You drop a lot of things, and when you drop pronouns, you might also be likely to drop discourse connected as well. So they kind of like function words, and in general, they tend to be dropped if possible. And another thing that has a lot of implication for or causing us problems we do the annotation is verb compounds. So there's a lot of verb compounds. I know some languages have verb compounds as well. The problem there is that how do you deal with verb compounds? So if there's a verb compound, that means there are more than one words, right? And what is the relation between them? And is it compositional or non-compositional? So some of them kind of become more of idiomatic, or they kind of should be understood together. And then you don't have all of these separate them. You just create maybe one concept. But for others, there's a very transparent relation between them, right? So so that's something you have to kind of deal with. If you just want to deal one way, let's say treat the entire verb compound as a concept, as a predicate, then you're going to have a lot of verb compounds, and then you're going to create a lot of entries for them. So that's that's a problem, right? And if you decompose them, you have to be careful to decide which ones is that composition, which one is not. And there's also the issue of grammaticalization. Some part, let's say you have two verbs. One of them is maybe grammaticalized. It's almost like a particle in English, right? Like pick up, right? So the up in Chinese, that might be just a verb, but in English that's a pronoun, right? So so there's a lot of things that we have to deal with. And there's also the word concept mismatches. It's not specifically just for Chinese. So here what I mean is are things like idioms. But there are some type idioms that are in Chinese but not necessarily in other languages. Right? So you have to figure out a way of dealing with them. So one of them is like a special type of proverbs, right? The ones that Julia mentioned for English yesterday. So there's a lot of those. So I'm not going to cover all of these. So it is like if I cover this, it's going to be a few hours. I'm going to pick a few just to give you a sense of what is if you want to do UMR annotation for your own language. And so there'll be kind of like linguistic issues, phenomena that you have to think about and think about how to do map to UMR. So the final mapping, the final product, you may use the same number of concepts, abstract concepts. You may use the same relations. You may use the same attributes. But the actual mapping for the individual kind of linguistic phenomena may not be the same. Right? So you may have to write some sort of guidelines for language for that to work. So, the basic thing, this is the same, right? So the UMR annotation annotates the argument structure for each predicate and connect them into a direct node label and edge label graph. So that's what we're talking about. This is the annotating payment notation, where entity is classifying the types. So this is like the basic stuff, right? Which is not different for other languages as well. Well, okay. So let's see. Is there enough English for you to understand what this means? So I'm going to try to explain this, right? So here's a good explanation for each one of them. But okay, so let's just impressionistically. So this is what it looks like in Chinese, right? If you don't know Chinese, oh, that's fine. So this is very basic ones, which is not very different from the ones that you have seen for English. So this just means that you have this whole sentence is hopefully this is the main predicate. So this means reference or cite, right? And so you have here is a network, a news network, and you have you do know what this is, right? So this is the time expression, which is 2012, and this is like the preposition so until 2012, and that this news, right? So this whole thing is not that hard. So you have so what you I want to point out is that you can use the same sort of vocabulary to describe the Chinese concept. So because this is a name entity, so we have to classify it, right? And we call it newspaper. Newspaper is really just, it's not a translation, it's really just like one type of name entities, right? And you can see that we are doing the same things like OP1, so which is really just a constant, that is the actual name of the newspaper, right? And this part is also the same, right? So, so the aspect for this is performance. It just means that that was used until 2012, and so this whole thing is finished, and therefore it's aspect, right? Although there is no aspect markers here, or what you do not recognize, right? And the relations, we also use arg1, arg0, arg1. So because we have, like English, have a prop bank where we have various lexicon, right? So this arg0s, arg1s, you can just look it up for this word, and you will see that you have this arg0, which is like kind of like the actor agent sort of thing. And you have this arg1, which is like the thing. I think in this case, just the thing. So you have the mod, right? So you have temporal, and you have OP here. So and for the time, so we kind of treat it the kind of same way as it's done in English. So you have a date entity where there's a year, right? So if you look at the whole thing, there is some. So what you can see is that there's a combination of the relations and abstract concepts that are used in UMR for all languages, and there are also some that you use for individual languages. So that's the key thing, right? So so if there is a name entity, you're going to be classified the same way as it does for English. If there's a date, you can do the same way for English. And all these relations are the same, all these attributes are the same, but there are some concepts that are specific to the language, right? So this is like a departure from, early days when people were working on something that works for all languages and called interlingua, right? And interlingua means that you're going to come up with the vocabulary that's shared for all languages, for all of them. That is hard, right? So instead, we are taking some sort of a middle ground, and we are saying there are some concepts, like these abstract concepts, which can apply for to all languages. And you have these relations which applies to all languages, and you have this attributes which can apply to all languages. But there are some of them, the lex items, you do not want to do that. There's just too many of them, right? So that's basically the point I want to make here from a different language. So these are just descriptions of the different parts of this example. That one is a simple one. Does not involve any kind of discrete relations or anything along those lines. Here's another one that's a little more real, more complex. It's taken from actual data. So I'm going to translate that actually, this one. So here is this, first you have this World Weekly, World Weekly News. So this is this part of it. So you can see that when you have this sort of brackets, double angle brackets, what's inside is usually a title of something. So this is the news. So was the defunct American supermarket tabloid. Anybody know anything about this? Never heard of it? Okay. So maybe it's defunct for a long time ago, right? American supermarket tabloid, so this is what it says. So this is the tabloid in American supermarket. So this part is stopped publication, so that's the defunct part of it. It's famous for reporting bizarre stories, urban legends, and spoof news. Okay? So these are kind of different kind of things, like this is part of the bizarre stories, urban legends, and spoof news. Right? I don't know how good this translation is, but okay, that's the translation, because some of this is really kind of hard to translate in a very precise way. Right? So that's the example. I'm just going to try to use it to illustrate a few points about. So there is a one-to-one translation here. So you can. So now that's pretty clear. So the first part of it is you're going to have to do this for Chinese. You have to do word segmentation first, right? So now you separate this into words. So this is a word, this is a word, this is a word, and all of these are words, right? So that's the first thing to do. In practice, you can either do this word segmentation manually, which is going to be very time consuming, or you run a tool. So there is a lot of word segmentation tools for Chinese but they're not going to be 100% accurate, right? So there will be some mistakes. So the question is, what do you do with them, right? So in the UMR writer, there is a way now that you can, like fix the word segmentation. Although even if you don't fix word segmentation, that should be still fine, because you can select, parts of a string that for the annotation. So that's to establish some sort of alignment between the concept in the UMR graph and the actual words in the sentence, right? So I think you're probably going to deal with that kind of problem. Let's say you work on some language that, correlates language, right? So it's probably not realistic to segment that into small morphemes. You may just have to have the whole thing, but highlight parts of it that correspond to some concept. So that will be something that's going to be a little different for different languages, but it's something you have to kind of deal with, right? So the other issues are interesting things will be the word segmentation is if there's a mistake, it can create mistakes in interpretation, right? So this part of it, so what I call urban legend, right? And if you segment this way, which is a possibility. So all these are you can be 3 words, and this one has 2 words, and individually as words they all exist in the language. Right? But the problem is that if you segment this way, it's a little hard to interpret what it means. So this is like this word means all, and this means can. So this is legend. Well, they can legend. Well, this makes no sense, right? And the correct segmentation should be something like this. So this is urban. This is legend. Okay, so that is essentially the nature of the word segmentation. You depending on the context, you segment that into something that's kind of makes sense semantically. So that's what what happens. And once you have done that, then you can annotate this part of it as something like this, right? So, the legend, that's Herbert. Okay. And here's another example. So this is the other parts from that. This whole thing is you can have possibly this sort of segmentation segmented into 2 words, so that would be strange news and anecdote, right? And the whole thing would be okay for the stories. The problem with this is that this is so common, and you can treat it as some sort of like an idiom. It happens all the time, right? There's no really real point in treating that as 2 words. So you can just like have one concept for this whole thing, and then the annotation will be just easier, just one concept, right? Yeah. So there will be imagine that if you work on some languages that have this kind of issues, like Vietnamese or something, you're going to be having similar kind of issues, right? To determine what exactly is a concept. Right? I already alluded to how we deal with this, right? So we just you're going to produce errors. We generally do not go back to correct them. Instead, we can select parts of it, or you select this together. So if this is under the annotation, the segmentation, you can just select those 2 pieces and put them together as just one concept. So it becomes a mapping problem between your UMR concepts and the words in the language. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to point out. So the other thing I wanted to point out is that that for English here you have this part of it that says the World Weekly News was a non-defunct American supermarket tabloid and famous for reporting bizarre stories. So there's something before famous, right? This is understood to be the World Weekly News, right? Although you don't kind of like wanted to propose that there is a pronoun here, because if you add a pronoun to it, the whole thing is still ungrammatical, so that syntactically doesn't make sense. But for Chinese, it's more like two clauses. So you can possibly propose that there's a drop pronoun here, right? So what is the difference? The difference is that it doesn't make a lot of sense to put a pronoun here. For English, it's going to read ungrammatical weird. But if you do it for Chinese, it actually kind of makes sense, right? So, so that's something that's an option, right? So how do you deal with this sort of thing, like drop pronouns? There are actually multiple ways of dealing with this. So one way of dealing with this is to kind of like just pretend it does not exist, which is actually fine, as long as you get all the other relations correct, right? So the relations between them is this, that you have a relation between it and this famous, right? so what is famous? Well, the thing that's famous is it, right? As long as you can preserve that in the UMR annotation, then you don't lose anything necessarily, right? So that's one way of dealing with this. So here it says, well, you have this newspaper, which is the one of this famous, right? So you kind of sidestep the whole thing and just say, well, that does not exist, and you do not lose anything. So in this way, you kind of treat it like English, right? Which is you don't propose some pronoun, you just say, well, there's reentrancy, or you use a inverse relation, and you capture the relationship between this famous and the newspaper, and that's you're done, right? But you could have other possibilities. So you could, for example, treat it as you have, instead of saying that does not exist, you have if you have a and as the root, between the entire sentence, right? So you treat this as, let's say, go back to the sentence here. So let's say that you have, say, this part of it before comma is a clause, right? And the thing that's after comma is another clause. Right? And then the whole thing will be, there is a connotation. So you propose something like there is a and on top of it, right? And this refers to the first clause, and that corresponds to the second clause, right? So that's another way of dealing with this. So in that case, one way to deal with this would be to have this reentrancy, right? So here you have this variable, and you're going to be using the same variable, which implies that these two are referring to the same thing, and you can deal with this way. Right? So this is this is also legitimate. Ultimately, you're going to derive the same sort of semantic relations as you do a first one. And okay, so you can do it in a third way, which is that you still treat these two. There are two clauses, and there is a connotation between them, and you still have another. You propose another concept, so you have another variable, which is called a thing, right? And this thing has this third person, and its number is singular, right? So in this way, you kind of treat it as two sentences, and at the document level, you're going to be linking this thing to that, right? So you can potentially have a lot of different ways of dealing with this. So they're all kind of equivalent. What would be the led to? So how do you decide which one is the right thing to do, right? So that's the first issue of is this are these two separate clauses, right? Or are they just two sentences? So that may now sounds like a problem. That's kind of like, okay, so that's obvious, right? So it should be just two clauses because there is this thing which is a period in Chinese, okay, the little circle, right? So like in English you use a dot, but in Chinese you use a circle. But in actual text, and there's there you can see all the time that there's just people are just using commas. Like you have an entire paragraph, you just comma, comma, comma. So you can't argue that these are just clauses, right? So that is a very tricky tricky problem. But I guess fortunately all three of them ultimately are going to be lead to the same sort of semantic implementation. So it's not too much of a problem. So we just adopt some sort of like operational definition of what a sentence is. So let's say we just pretend any time that you have this, that's going to be a sentence, right? And then you would have to annotate these sort of things accordingly. So that's basically the thing here. So there could be something that you could be encountering in annotating some languages when what is counted as sentence is not very clear necessarily. So for English, that's simply a very more strict notion of a sentence, right? So if you just do commas, and the teacher is going to say, "Well, that's not grammatical." But if you just do it for Chinese, well, that's okay. Nobody's going to say that's not grammatical. Okay. Okay. So
excuse me.
Yeah.
You said that the choice between the three options would be related to the fact to whether we consider it as a clause or a sentence?
Yes.
Why? Why would you use that as a criteria to choose one of?
Okay, I guess your question is whether you can just treat it the same way, whether it's a clause or a sentence, right? So I guess part of it is that this is inherited from the AMR. So in AMR, they're dealing with sentence level annotation, right? Mm-hmm. So when there is something like this, they're just going to be doing it like, let's say, this way. So this is called this reentrancy, right? You just reuse the variable in a different place. Right? The UMR annotation also does that essentially at the sentence level. So it's not trying to create another different variable and then try to link them. And if they're in a sentence, if there are different sentences, so they will be more treated as kind of like this way, right? So I don't think there is any principled linguistic reason for doing that. It's more practical. Like it's a little hard to keep track of all the variables in the entire document. It's easier to do it and say, well, here's a variable, we can reuse it in the same sentence. It's harder to say the beginning of a sentence with this variable I'm going to use in a 10 sentence. Okay, I have to use that again, right? So I think that's really the reason. I don't think there is any like a theoretical reason or any kind of fundamental deep theoretical reason for doing that way.
So, and you are talking about implicit pronouns in Chinese. I don't know if they behave exactly as the null subject in languages like Portuguese.
Yes.
So we would annotate the null subjects in a language like Portuguese the same way, right?
Yes.
According.
Yeah, I think it's similar. Other than the fact that in Portuguese, if I write, I don't know Portuguese, you get some sort of agreement information from the word.
Yes.
Which helps you recover the pronoun, right?
Yes.
In Chinese, you have nothing, right? So you really just have to infer that, from the sentence and context.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so all right, so that's so I talk about pronouns and how they related to how you determine whether they are sentences or clauses and how you deal with them. And the third thing I want to mention in this sentence is that the Chinese also, there's no equivalent of and. I remember should qualify that as in, there is something that's when you connect two nouns, like apples and oranges. Like there is something that equivalent to that and. But there's no equivalent of and that connects to two clauses, right? So, so in this sentence, you can see that there is no and. There is only a comma. So you kind of a lot of the cases when and is needed, if this were a English sentence, and in Chinese we just use comma instead, right? So so what do you do with that, right? So we don't propose so we propose an and thing, which is a kind of connects. It's like a kind of discorrelation, which Julia talked in the morning. So we don't use a comma here as a concept, right? So we just kind of infer there is some sort of implicit discorrelation that applies here. Right? So that could be the case for maybe other languages as well. If their discourse relations are represented the exact same way as, not the same way as English, right? So you could be running into things like that. All right, so there are other. So that's and. That's pretty common. So there are other type of discourse relations which can also be dropped. For instance, you. So I really don't like you. So if you come, I'll just go. I don't want to stay away from us together with you. Okay. In Chinese, you don't have to have this if. You just say okay, you come, I'll go. Okay. But it's very clear that there is a condition that's implied here, right? And you can actually put in a word that corresponds to it. Right? So this would be the sort of things that are happening. And so we need to kind of infer that sort of discorrelation and have something inferred. So this is why I suppose we have these so-called abstract concepts, right? Abstract in the sense that they do not always correspond to some specific word. Right? It's something that you can infer from the text. But I would caution that you don't want to go too far. If you want to start to infer stuff, you're going to be there's a lot of things that can be inferred, right? So there has to be some sort of limit as to what you want to infer. So discourse relations tend to be one of those things that are closed, right? So there's just not an infinite number of them, and it's okay to infer them. But if it's more of something that's some arguments just dropped for some word, and if you infer those, that's going to be a lot of them. If you want to infer working relations, that's kind of a lot of them. So you kind of have to have this sort of boundary. You do not want to go too far with this, right? But limited amount of them seems to be necessary in order to kind of have a reasonably, like a semantic representation, right?
Sorry, in the previous sentence in Chinese, couldn't you have just a temporal interpretation? When you come, I will go.
You say it's more temporal than conditional.
I don't know in Chinese if we can interpret it like that. Because this would mean that would be very difficult to annotate if it is ambiguous between these two readings. Of course, the context can give you the right interpretation, right? But I'm just wondering if you don't have the connector, if we could have both the interpretations.
Actually, this is more like, okay, either one of those, if that's possible, you have to infer it, right? So that's the fundamental point is that this is inherent, it is implicit, right? Mm-hmm. That does not change. Yeah. For this example, can you infer a temporal relation? I don't think you can. This is actually pretty conditional. A few other, what is it? Is this? Can you infer some sort of temporal relation between them? When you come, I'll go.
If you were closing a store and waiting for the next person to come, could you say exactly this, or would it look different? Like as soon as the next shift comes, you'll
not quite. You need to have some sort of like, the aspect marker. 你来了，我就走。对 After you can come, I'll go.
Okay, interesting.
But if you just have that, you cannot.
Which spectral marker would you have?
It's like a perfective kind of.
Perfective.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So that implies that that has finished. When that's finished, I'll leave.
But you'll still have the future reading?
You
When
still
you
have
come
the
in the
future. Yeah, you still
future?
have the yeah.
Oh,
You
okay.
can. Yeah. So you still have the future. So it's a finish in the future. Okay. Not.
And something like, when I arrive home, you will have finished your homework or something like that. In this case, you would also have this perfective marker, right? For will have finished.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
It would be the same.
Yeah. Kind of similar. Yes.
Yeah.
So it's really the entire context. So I mean that's one fundamental issue about annotation. Is like you kind of do you just annotate the literal meaning of what was there in isolation, or do you infer the semantic annotation based on context?
If you are annotating at the sentence level, you have no other option, right?
Yes, but the UMR we annotate at document level.
Yeah, but you annotate
Yeah,
document.
so that's one of the reasons for doing this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, sentence level, it could be more ambiguous, right? Because you don't know what the context is. Yeah. All right, so that's okay, aspect. So there is no. So I mentioned there is no tense and morphology. I think some. So the question came up yesterday was, why not just annotate tense? Okay, the problem is that in Chinese you don't have tense. Okay, so does neither does I think Vietnamese. Like there are some languages that does not have tense markers.
But you have temporal interpretation.
You do, yes.
Yeah, so.
Well, so you have temporal interpretation, right? Then the question is, I think, is always the temporal interpretation. A lot of time is relative to something else, right? The question is to determine what is that something else, right? So is it necessary always the document creation time or the utterance time, which is basically what tense represents, right? So if you want to make it a lot more, for languages, some more don't have tense. So why do you have to kind of like assume that you always have to interpret some sort of the time of event based on the utterance time or the document creation time? There's no principal reason for doing that, right? And actually, in fact, there's one example I would argue that you cannot really just rely on the document creation time. So I gotta get to that, right? Yeah, but the important thing is that there is there is a tense. It doesn't mean that there is no sense of temporal information in the Chinese language. So there is things can be placed in a time, right? It's just not that there are no tense markers for it. And you could, one example would be you can just do, if you have, you go all the way to the first sentence. So if you have this sort of thing, well then you're definitely going to have a time, right? It's just that it's not reflected on the verb itself. But that's just one of the things. But let me just talk a little bit about aspect first. So aspect and the intense markers, they tend to be happen together, right? So actually, Chinese does have aspect markers. But it's just that they're not there for each verb instance. Unlike an English verb, it's finite. There's always going to be tense on it. If it's not, then it's not grammatical, right? But aspect markers, it really depends sometimes on the verb itself, whether it's one syllable or two syllables, or whether it's rhythmically kind of like natural to have one, right? So it's more. But most of the time, if you read that, they do not exist, right? But you can still infer from the context, right? So here, so here, this is the product that refers to the defunct, right? So that's like a state. So you can infer that to be the case. Before it stopped, and it's being published, and we assume that's going to be published continuously, right? So that's more like habitual in that sense. And this identity, so this is that kind of tabloid, so that's more of a state. Right? So here you can infer this, like report is more of a habitual kind of thing, right? So even without it, you still can infer some sort of aspectual information. Just like if you look at this original example, none of this, there's no abstract markers here, although there are a few unit words. But it could be, but this is, this when there is no abstract markers, it is the harder part of the annotation. So when we train annotators, so this is one thing that's really difficult for them to investigate. When there is some, when there is something you can see there, it's a lot easier. When you tell people that actually there is this thing that's like habitual, but you don't see the marker for it, and that's just harder for them to get. So there's more training needed for the part of the annotators. Okay, so finally, so temporal relations. So this is one, I have an example here. So this is one example that I've used. Sometimes I have native speakers telling me, oh, your intuition is not correct. But so let me just go over and see if you can get the same intuition as I do, or you get something else, right? So let's say that you have this sentence, the Pentagon said today, that it will re-examine the question. Okay, and so this is pretty much the same. The Pentagon said today that it would re-examine the question. So the only difference here is this will and this is would, right? So you want to reinterpret the temporal relations of, let's say, re-examine. So we wanted to find a reference point for this, right? Do we want to say that is the temporal relation clearer if it's with reference to the first verb said, or is it clearer when it's with reference to the DCT, which is the documentation time, right? And we ask the same question again if we change this to would. So is this clearer? There is a clearer temporal relation between re-examine and said, or there's a clearer relation between re-exam and DCT, right? I would say that in the first one is clearer with respect to the documentation time, right? So this is just re-exam is after whatever this document is written, right? In the second one, you cannot be say for sure that this is after the document creation is written, right? Can this be happening before this was published? Yeah. It could, right?
Yes.
So because you cannot even determine the relation between these two, between re-examine and DCT, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to say, well, that's the reference time, right? So this is the one kind of like argument to say, well, like it doesn't really make sense to always judge the temporal location of some event with respect to the document creation time. And when there is no morphology in the language, well, there's more reason for not doing that, right? So like if there's tense, well, you kind of like you use that has a lot of information, and it's easier to do it that way. In general, but this is actually pretty hard in practice. This is a clear example. There are a lot of cases where like there are multiple events, which can potentially be be setting up a reference time for an event that's later. I would say 80% of the time is clear which one you should choose. Here, 20% of the time it's really hard to determine which one that should be. One inspiration that I got when working on this problem is from some work that done by Claudia Smith. She was in University of Texas in Austin, I believe. So her research basically, he actually did research on Chinese. That's what I got that caught my attention. Her research says there is a strong correlation between the type of writing with how temporal relations are interpreted. So if you have narrative stories like the ones that fairy tales or something, and if you look at them, those stories tend to be happening with the events in a kind of like a sequence, right? So this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. They all kind of one off another. So in that case, you can always say, well, so the previous one is going to be the reference of this one, right? Because that's after that, and then the next one is after that. So that's a very easy kind of like a temporal structure. But there are also reports, like the news reports. They do not follow that order, right? So they might say they could go back and forth, and they say, in April, this thing happened, last year, and that happened. So you really cannot do it that way. So the temporal structure there is mostly going to be, the reference time will be some sort of like a temporal expression, right? So that's a more natural way of interpreting that kind of writing. So I guess my point here is that the temporal relations, the annotation temporal relations really can be informed by the type of data that you're dealing with. So you're going to have different kind of patterns, and vice versa, right? So if you can deal with the temporal relations, then you can determine what type of genre that is. Right? So that's a very useful information in the other direction as well. Right? Okay, now going back to the so if I've convinced you that with that, so going back to the temporal annotation for Chinese. So so in UMR, I guess that's the one departure from like previous work on meaning representations. Right? So typically, like DRS, they generally annotate text. Right? So the utterance time, and so before, after, and they stop with that. Right? In UMR, we try to generalize that and to say every time you're going to be identify a reference time, right? And that reference time can be an event. It could be something else. So that also makes the annotation a little harder, right? Because well, in some cases easier, right? Because in cases where the document create time doesn't even make sense, right? So that's easier, right? But a lot of cases, because you have to find what is the reference time, that's make it a little bit harder to do. So that'll be something you will find in actual practice. That this is one of the harder places, along with an aspect for annotation. All right. So the most appropriate time, reference time, might be another event or another time expression. It could be, sometimes it can be both, right? Or what makes the temporal relations more concrete is essentially, the reference time. A couple of things that you have to consider. One is that there should be a clear temporal relation between the reference time and whatever you're considering. Right? If there is no clear relation, then it doesn't make sense to make it a reference. And the second thing would be that if assuming there are multiple possible reference points, and which one is the closest, right? Give you the most concrete location of the time. So that's another criteria that you should be looking for. Even with those two criteria, sometimes it's not be that easy to determine what exactly that is. Right? Okay. So here, these examples. So going back to this example here, right? So and I think in this case, let's say, what do we do with the time, right? So here we say this. So this publishing kind of overlaps with stop, right? So here, like, it says the stop here, and then the publishing, right? So the publication, the activity is stopped, right? So we see this, whatever the time of stop is, that's a reference point for publication. Right? So you have this famous, right, which is contain this publication, right? So there's overlap content. So we have some discussions there in the morning about content and versus overlap. Right? And there's the publication and overlaps with reporting, right? So nowadays, so all of these use a different thing other than the documentation time as reference point. Right? So I think a question arrived this morning, like, okay, so if you always use the other event as a reference point, do they happen in the past or the future? So ultimately you have that kind of question. But hopefully, if you got all the relations right in the entire document, at least some of them should be in reference to the documentation time, right? And by virtue of that fact, and if you kind of like, the temporal relations are transitive, right? So if you can get some of them will be, the reference point will be the documentation time, and you maybe infer whether it should be before or after. Right? So that's the idea. This is a really hard problem in itself because you could be, let's say, considering each event and every other event, what's the relation between them. And that is actually what people have been trying to do. But it's really, that's really impractical, right? So if you suppose that you have like 10 events in the documents, which is kind of very short documents. And if you look at all the events with respect to all the others, so it's going to be close to 100, right? So very quickly, that's no longer practical. So there is a practical reason for doing this way, is that you try to say, you find each time you find this reference time, and hopefully they will connect together into a graph, which allows you to do the time interpretation. So that's the point, right? But it's still kind of like a harder, one of the harder problems. I would say this is harder than the mode annotation for UMR.
But so you don't explicitly say which is the reference time. The reference time, we infer that it is the one to which the event is connected.
Yeah, we do, right? Because every time you have, so let's say you're consider this event, and you determine that, so that's the reference time, right? So it's a triple, right? The triple, you have a so-called head, and the head is the reference time in this case.
So what is your concept of reference time? The one that is used by Raschenbach or Campbell? What is your concept of reference time, right? Because we have this reference time as proposed by Campbell, that is the one that makes the narrative goes forward, and then we have the one proposed by Raschenbach.
No.
So which one are you considering here?
I think it's more closer to Raschenbach, right? But you know, I need to go get back to make sure that there are some subtle differences that I may have missed. But the general idea is that you find some sort of reference event and to interpret what this current time is. Right? So is it? I need to refresh my memory on his work in order to say a little differently about that. Yeah.
I thought it was, yeah. What you said is what that was my impression too. Right back also.
Yeah. In general, like, when you have this linguistic work, and you try to operationalize that in an actual annotation product, you kind of have to make some sort of adaptations. Right? So this may that may not exactly matches what he has there, but that's kind of the general kind of idea. All right. So some other dependencies, right? So we do that for so we have the same thing for Chinese. I don't think there's too much here that I can say that's different. So than English, right? So the one basic point of this is that just like the reference time for time annotation is not always the documentation time, and kind of the cognizer. I thought it was conceivable, but that's just changed recently, right, Julia? Let's see the change to change that. The cognizer is not always the author, right? So let's say when you have something like this person says this person gets sick, right? So your information about getting sick is from this, not from the author, right? So that's essentially the main thing about the model dependency. But this point is not any different from English. All right. So, all right. So let me see this. Let me just skip something so that I can get to something that's a little different than English. Say. Okay, maybe just a little bit about the idioms. I guess idioms are different. Are difficult in that sense that they're, there are obviously idioms in other languages too, right? I guess what's different here in Chinese is that you don't have the word segmentation in the first place, right? So when you say a multi-word expression, so idiom is a type of multi-word expression. That implies that you know what the words are. Even if you don't know what the words are, then, telling something is a multi-word expression is you have to do the word segmentation first before you can decide what that is, right? So for things like this, so here is a multi-word idiom, multi-word expression. That means like stir-fried squid. Okay. So that company like stir-fried squid, meaning that he was fired from that company, right? Maybe hard for you to see the connection between stir-frying a squid with firing. So when you stir-fry a squid, what happens? It's gonna curl up, right? So when you fire, it just means that you kind of curl up, like roll up your belongings and just leave. So in that sense, it's like so that's how that gets that from again. I guess what I want to say here is that so this is a multi-word expression because there is a aspect marker between them. So that means that you can't be just saying, no, that's just one word, right? And it's clear this is a verb, and that's there's actual literal meaning for this squid, right? So what you do in annotation would be that you want to say, well, this should map to a single concept, right? One thing that happens is that typically with this sort of thing, you may not already have an entry in your Willis lexicon, right? So you rely entirely on like the lexicon to determine what is X1, what is X0, right? But you don't have them. So what we do typically is just to say, well, for the moment we just say that's 0, 0, meaning we don't have anything yet. We're going to add that later on. Fortunately, usually the argument structure for these sort of things is simple, it's straightforward. You don't have to, so it's easy to go back and add them, right? So this is maybe one thing you're going to be encountering with your annotation is that your vocabulary, your lexicon may not be enough. maybe covering all the things. You may just have to add entries along the way, which is like can be a little tedious, right? Because you kind of have to go back and forth. So the tool can the UMR does have the functionality to allow you to do this, right? So which helps. But if you don't have it, and you can just like do something like this and go back to modify them. This is another example, which is kind of similar, right? So he hit a snag in that company. So hit a snag is a multiple expression. So this one, I guess, is kind of similar for English, right? So it's interesting sometimes that you have similar sort of idioms across languages. And we have a lot of this sort of thing in Chinese. So you can see that this 4-character idioms, and we have a lot of them. And they typically come with some sort of story behind them, historical story, and they kind of like later on give you some sort of meaning that's different from what they mean initially. So here, this idiom means that in ancient times in military fighting, so you every time you make some advance, you trying to establish some sort of stronghold, and you move less forward. So just be very careful step by step, and so that's what it means today, right? So it's no longer people don't necessarily know what it means initially, but it just means that it's doing something step by step. So that's let's see, and then you have so this, I guess you have that for English as well, right? You have this entire expression, which is mountains are high and the emperor's is far. That's an English? You have that for English. You don't have it?
Yeah, I think so.
You do? All right.
Really? You're saying yes.
Examples for these
Mountains are high, the emperor is far. You have that in
I have more in my head saying
Okay. Well, you may have it, but you maybe have borrowed somewhere else.
You have it now.
So here, this is not.
Does it mean that we have some time, or to worry about that amount takes time?
It means that the supervisor can't see
Very
far away, right?
Ah, okay. When the cat's away, the mice will play.
Am I wrong?
Yeah, you look like you are the one that thinks that changes.
Okay, now I understood that every single of us understand this robots. How can they, understand this? But what do you see when you are doing this? Mountains are high. Okay, then I will use it.
That means you're free. Nobody is watching over you. So that's what it means. Okay.
Thank you.
But but I guess the point here is that this is not a literal. It doesn't. You can do this sort of structure, right? So this is a literal annotation of the meaning of this sentence, right? So this is the high, the mountain is high, okay, the emperor is far, right? You can have that, but this is kind of like not very meaningful, right? Because you really cannot understand this expression that way, right? So you have to have some way of indicating that is not how you can interpret it, right? And that is something. So there is going to be a lot of things like this, right? So you spend a lot of time figuring out what a structure is, and really this whole thing is really meaningless because you really should be just like the implied meaning that you care about, right? I guess in UMR we just at least try to mark this as something that you should be interpret differently. And do not try to get in there and try to do some information extraction, like extract some mountains or extract some emperors. That's not what they're referring to, right? don't know whether you have those things in other languages, right? There's another type of thing that one has one argument. Okay, so this really just wrap this whole thing into this is a problem. Interpret this differently in semantic. There's another type which is a little different. So this is like saying you shoot mosquitoes with cannon. And then so this give you what it actually says. So it's like solving small problems with big action, right? So you wanted to let's say you make it a little bigger. So use a missile to shoot some mosquitoes, right? So it means that you're already just overkill, right? So this is what the whole thing means. Right? And this has both parts of the meaning. The first part is the literal part of it, and the second part is the actual kind of inferred part of it. So this proverb 91 allows you to do, have this first argument, which is the literal side of the meaning, and second part, which is the kind of like the actual inferred meaning, right? So you're going to be having things like that for, I don't know whether, there might be things like that. I think Julia has example for English too, for this sort of thing, right?
Yeah.